Hello, my name is Joe Cartwright and welcome to my studio. Today we're going to look at how to paint sand dunes. When painting sand dunes, shadows are very important. In particular, you have to understand the difference between cast shadows and form shadows. So a cast shadow, like we have in this image here, is a sharp edge, and it's called a cast shadow because the little undulation in the sand blocks the light and creates that sharp edge. So that's one type of shadow you have to be aware of. And the other one is what we call a form shadow. It shows you the form of the object. And form shadows are soft edged. So if we were to look at, say, this shadow here, this is a soft shadow and that's a form shadow. It's indicating the form of the hill. Cast shadows are sharper edged, form shadows are softer edged. So they're the two key things I'd like you to keep in mind while we're painting these sand dunes. So let's begin. I'll start with a very simple drawing. Now wet the back of the paper. I'll let that sit there, and while it's doing that, let's mix some colours. We'll mix a colour for our sky and a colour for our sand. Sky is a bright cobalt blue colour. For the sand, we'll mix some raw umber, a little bit of burnt sienna, but it's not so warm, so I'll add a small amount of cobalt blue to that as well. Very good. Now if we go back to our paper, as it's been absorbing some moisture, it first starts to cockle, and then I add more water to that. And finally the paper will fully expand and sit flat on our board. I'll wet my board. Now something else to consider is the direction of the light. So we can see from the shadow that the light is coming from the left hand side of our image. So if you ever have any doubt as to where the light's coming from, just look at your shadows, and the light's going to be coming from a direction opposite the direction of the shadow. So I'll start with this cobalt blue. And then I'll dilute that by dipping my brush in the water. And that'll give us the area the light's coming from. And also, as the sky moves further away, it gets lighter in tone. I'm going to darken this up here a bit more. Again, dilute that. This area here has lots more light on it. Some of this area down here is in partial shade, primarily because the light's probably shining through the foliage. So what I'll do for that is I'll bring some of this sky colour down. Just a very weak sky mix. Good. So that's our initial wash. I'm going to mix a blue-grey colour for the distant hills. Just some French ultramarine, small amount of raw umber. And then we've got some plants along the ridge line. So I'll mix a green for that. Start with some aureolin, some cobalt turquoise, and that will work well for the bright green. And here, the duller green, so I'll start with some raw umber for that, some French ultramarine, some aureolin, and that'll do for that. Now, I don't want a lot of paint in my brush. So I'll start with some wet on wet edges because the distant hill is still wet. And again, I'll vary the shape and size and spacing of of these bushes. So this is just the underpainting of the brighter areas of these bushes. Now I'll dry that, and then we can go in with the darker shapes and the more sharp edge shapes. Very little paint on my brush now. I'm just creating these broken edges. Not being too particular with the bright colours because I'm going to now go in with the darker tones. It's important to retain some of these bright shapes. And again, I'll mix a slightly darker tone. All right, I'll dry that and then we can do the sand. haven't totally dried every little part of this foliage area because I don't mind if some of that colour bleeds into the sand. I just didn't want it to do that all the way along that edge. Alright, so there's some strong light here and over here. So for that, I'll get my sand colour, take out about half the paint in the brush and then dip it in clean water. We'll just start with that. Bit more water. Now I'm just going to mix a dark brown, just raw umber burnt sienna and some French ultramarine. I'm going to lift some of these highlight areas. It's probably dry enough. Alright, I'll now go and dry that. Okay, so now we need to add the undulations in this sand, and we're going to do that primarily with our form and cast shadows. So for the shadow colour, primarily I'm going to use French ultramarine and a little bit of permanent rose. Making sure I don't lean this violet that I create towards the red. I want to keep it leaning to a slightly bluish violet. Now I mixed it in the leftover cobalt blue there. It really doesn't matter. I just didn't particularly want to take the time to clean it. And I'll add just a small amount of burnt sienna. I don't need to add a lot of burnt sienna in this case, which greys off that violet colour that we produce. The reason I don't need to grey it off too much is we've got lots of burnt sienna on the paper already, and that will optically grey these shadow colours. I'll add just a little bit more burnt sienna. Now the distant shadow is going to be lighter than these foreground ones, so again, pick up some of this shadow colour, drag my brush through the edge of my palette, and then dip it about 1/4 of an inch into the cleanish water. And then for the soft edge, I'll just go in with a damp brush. It's really barely damp. You can see doesn't have a lot of water in it. Some of the little plants along the edge will cast a shadow. And these marks in the sand are probably footsteps, and I soften a few of those. even in the area of the cast shadow, because of the undulations, you'll still get some soft edges there as well. Here I'm putting in the shadows of the grasses even before I've painted the grasses in. I'll go back later and put them in. You have to do this stage fairly quickly because you need to go in and soften these edges before they dry. Now I'll mix some of this brown and the green together. Just using my fan brush is the quickest way to paint this. Now I'll get my rigger. Vary the colour. I'll get a corner of a credit card. I've cut the sharp edge off that. And I'm going to scrape in just a few grasses and that are in the light. I scrubbed away some of the paint underneath so that I wouldn't have a really hard edge showing through this lighter coloured bush in the foreground. I'm going to put in some harder edge shapes for these pebbles on the sand. That soft edge can be used as their shadow. Be mindful of the light's coming from this direction, so the shadows will be away from that. This branch will have a shadow. Same with these shapes. Just using some of these darker colours to adjust the tones of some of these distant shapes. Throw a few birds in the sky. This area is a bit too bright close to the edge of the paper, so I'm going to just add some more shadow in there. And that'll bring the eye back to this area and this area over here. I hope you've enjoyed this painting. If you have, please give it a like, and if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do so. And if you're able, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I look forward to seeing you for the next one.